I'm coming to you from Tara, which is in Dawes Point in Sydney, which is next to Talawalada, which is the rocks down by the harbour. This land has been stewarded by Aboriginal people for tens of thousands of years, and I want to pay my respects and marvel at their amazing enduring culture that we have in this country. And so shout out to their elders past, present and emerging, and note that sovereignty has never been ceded. So today we are launching a gender lens investing expert guide, and at Altiorem we are, as many of you will know, a community built sustainable finance library, and as well as having a wealth of resources which we hope and our desire is to help the industry to and advocates within the industry to be more effective and to be able to implement sustainable finance strategies by cutting through the noise, summarizing content and connecting it together in a way that allows them to be more effective. We also love exploring issues that have the potential and interventions that have the potential to yield enormous benefits. And so that's why we're really delighted in our first expert guide. And this is a series that we will be starting from today to be focusing on gender lens investing, because what we know about gender equity today and gender diversity is that women still are paid much less than men for doing the same job, that caring work is overwhelmingly done by women and not recognised in kind of the economic math that runs the world. And we also know that there are enormous benefits that can be yielded by improving equity and diversity for companies, for economies, and indeed in trying to address massive challenges that we face like climate change and biodiversity. And so it truly is an issue where if we can drive positive change, we can yield multiple benefits in lots of different areas. And so that's why we're incredibly excited to be launching this guide today. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague and co-founder Alexandra Brown, who will take you through the guide. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us.
Thank you, Pablo, and to our panelists and everyone here, welcome. We will be having an engaging panel discussion shortly, but first I'm going to be delivering a presentation. It'll be about 20 minutes, exploring how we can support women through gender lens investing. We'll then bring in our speakers and answer any questions you may have. So please feel free to pop them in the question chat as we go. We will try to get to as many as possible in our panel discussion. So first, we're going to look at why gender lens investing is a good thing beyond those feel-good factors of investing in positive change. Next, we break down what gender investing looks like. So what does it actually mean? What do fund managers do to construct a fund with a gender lens? And finally, we will unveil Altiorem's inaugural expert guide on gender lens investing. As we'll be discussing financial products, we do have to lead with this disclaimer. The main points are that we make no warranties about the accuracy or reliability of the information provided, although of course we do believe it's accurate. And under no circumstances is this to be considered investment recommendations, financial advice or professional services. This presentation is for education only. This is such a powerful quote, and actually I took it from some Prometheus Capital collateral that one of our speakers, Ivka, sent to me. How wonderful is it that nobody need wait for a single moment before starting to improve the world? And as investors, we have the chance to be change makers and create a better world for women, girls, and those who identify as women. So let's start with why gender lens investing is a good thing. I'm about to go through some stats and facts and figures on why gender lens investing makes good sense and why we should allocate our capital, be that by investing in a company directly or many companies through pension or investment portfolios to close the gender gap. Why does it make good sense? So the reason why I start with this question is to create change. Just one moment, sorry. To create change, many of you may need to make the case for gender lens investing, and it's helpful to have some supporting evidence behind you. Perhaps you need to make the case to your manager or CEO, to your colleagues, to your financial advisor, to your spouse, your family, or your friends. So I hope that this will help strengthen your ability to make the case for gender considerations in investments and give you greater support in your own advocacy. When I'm looking at making the case for gender considerations in investments, I like to look at it from 4 different perspectives. And this gives you lots of firepower in your toolkit because each case will resonate with a different audience. In banking and finance, while the investment case may be priority, you may need to lean on the ethical, business and economic rationale for investing with a gender lens. So let's explore the benefits of gender lens investing from the ethical case, investment, business and economic case. Gender equality is a fundamental and inviolable human right, yet women around the world continue to face significant economic, social and legal barriers to equality. Women are more likely than men to be unemployed, are overrepresented in low-wage jobs, hold fewer managerial, entrepreneurial and leadership positions, and on average only make 79 cents for every dollar earned by men. In 18 countries, men can legally prevent their wives from working. Women continue to bear disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work and often experience maternity-related discrimination. Women entrepreneurs also face particular challenges. In fact, less than 1% of spending by large businesses on suppliers is earned by women-owned businesses, less than 1%. And these types of circumstances may just not feel right to you. So investing to empower women might simply feel good. You might feel driven by concepts like fairness and equity and social justice. When making the ethical case, it may be as simple as saying, it feels right to me and I want to move my money, my business, our investment strategy towards supporting women and gender equity. Women in leadership is commonly defined as women on boards and in senior management and is the most documented indicator of gender balance and the one most strongly tied to corporate performance. The overarching results of research in this space is that women in leadership improves company profitability and productivity. According to a report by McKinsey & Company from 2018, companies who were at the top for gender diversity and inclusion were 21% more likely to outperform on profitability, 21% more likely to outperform. Companies at the bottom were 29% more likely to lag in profitability. In fact, the research demonstrates that increasing the representation of women across each of the key leadership roles in an organisation added market value of between 52 million and 70 million per year for an average-sized organisation. Now, there are a few theories for this. Some suggest that diverse boards might benefit companies financially because diversity provides greater creativity and different perspectives for decision-making. Others think that diverse boards are improving overall board talent. But there is no doubt that diverse teams help a business overall and are critical for innovation, better decision-making, team performance, and improved reputation. Let's move to the investment case. Again, there is significant research showing improved financial metrics with women in leadership, such as lower risk and higher sales growth, EPS growth, and return on assets, just to name a few, because there are many. And as at Q1 this year, the global public market of Gender Lens equity funds was US 4.2 billion and growing, and Gender Lens fixed income was estimated at 8.9 billion. However, these figures do not represent all investment opportunities to positively impact and empower women. Gender Lens investing has moved beyond an examination of how many women are serving at the highest levels of a company, and now includes investment in companies that prioritise gender-balanced processes and policies, products, services, and accessibility. Therefore, the market to invest towards achieving gender equity will be considerably higher than these figures indicate. Research shows there is alpha in gender equality and diversity. The benefits to businesses that we just spoke of means that funds who invest in companies that prioritise gender equality can potentially outperform, which means investors may make better returns. But beware, with the growing trend to invest with a gender lens comes pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is when a company or investment appears to integrate more than they actually do. So just because a pension fund or investment fund or a company states that they are focused on empowering women, we need to look under the hood. Companies may state they have women on the board, but then the treatment of women throughout the rest of the company is poor. Is there a difference in how men and women feel working for a company? Is it safe? Are there equal opportunities? Is there flexibility? And funds may state they have a gender lens, but then where's the evidence in leadership and governance of the companies that they're investing? So the economic case. Now, of the 4 cases, this for me is one of the most powerful. It's a sad fact that gender inequality cuts across every single country on earth. No matter where you are born, your life will be harder if you're born a girl. If you are born in a poor country or district, it will be even harder. Gender inequality systematically disadvantages half of humanity. Factors continuing to disempower women include reduced access to education and the labour force, and social norms such as the average woman completing 3 to 6 hours of unpaid domestic work per day compared to half to 2 hours by men. Globally, there is a 24% gap between labour force participation between women and men. Gender inequality impacts economic performance. There can be no robust economy without gender equality. It's a critical ingredient of any strategy for durable, resilient, and more inclusive growth. It's estimated that on average across the OECD, a 50% reduction in the gender gap in labour force participation would add 6% to GDP by 2030. If we completely close that gap, we would double that to 12% addition to GDP. There's growing evidence to suggest that investing in women is needed to address the climate crisis and food security issues. So gender equality and these big global issues intersect. For example, investing in female farmers increases resilience to climate shocks, nourishing school communities and protecting food supplies. Educated women can help their communities to cope with the effects of climate change and lead on climate-smart agriculture, tackling hunger while protecting our planet. There is huge economic potential. Investment in women boosts economic development, competitiveness, job creation, and GDP. And this seems like the perfect time to move into the Sustainable Development Goals. So these 17 global goals were agreed upon by most governments and states back in 2015 with the aim of achieving the goals and the underlying targets by the year 2030. For investments to have an impact related to SDG 5, which is achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, investors do not have to invest solely in gender lens funds. Action to support gender equality can contribute positively to a host of other goals. With women and girls making up more than half the global population, improving health and educational outcomes, so goal 3 and 4, reducing poverty, goal 1, and tackling inequality, goal 10, requires specific consideration of the particular needs of women and girls and the barriers that they face. At the same time, women's empowerment is proven to have a multiplier effect, contributing to the health and well-being of whole families and communities, as well as economic growth, goal 8, and peaceful societies, goal 16. Just take a sip of water. So you may be thinking that achieving SDG 5 gender equality is out of your reach, but the fact is that we can all help allocate capital towards this goal and also the other SDGs. This image depicts the investment chain and how money flows from you, me, us, people, through asset owners, through investment managers, through banks, governments, foundations, and companies that we invest in and support. It's investor money and managed capital flowing to the Sustainable Development Goals, and every little bit counts. It's estimated that we need about US $7.5 trillion directed to achieving the SDGs each year to achieve them by the year 2030, and we're about $4 trillion per year short, so you can make a difference. We now move on to what investing with a gender lens looks like through the different investment approaches. So what types of investment strategies can be used to move money away from areas that disempower women to themes and the key issues that will positively impact gender equality? Gender lens investment approaches have expanded in recent years, and all asset classes have seen a tremendous increase in the number of funds and assets under management. So let's explore 4 approaches to GLIs. Gender Lens 1.0 involves investing in businesses that support women in leadership. So that is women founders, women CEOs, women on the board, and women in management. Because these metrics can be obtained more readily, often from publicly available corporate data, the gender-related outcomes of this strategy can be reported on. For example, in the latest results for the Prometheus Gender Forward Fund, on board diversity metrics, the portfolio scores 59% better than the benchmark. For executive diversity, 60% better. And for C-suite diversity, an impressive 269% better than the benchmark. But while women in leadership remains a key component of investment strategies with a gender mandate, it alone does not ensure equitable conditions for all employees. So this quote sums up the demand for deeper gender lens strategies. Many individuals, family offices, endowments and foundations now argue for Gender Lens 2.0, the evolution of strategies that peer deep into the culture of a company and its business policies and how these policies are enacted to produce social outcomes. Gender equity means bridging the historical gaps and fostering a culture generally more supportive of women. As access to company data has expanded, fund managers and investors can take a deeper look at the underlying gender equity policies and practices. So Gender Lens 2.0 means preferencing companies that implement processes that are free from and prevent gender-based discrimination across the workplace, marketplace, and community. For example, compliance training on the company's sexual harassment policy, a program working to address gender-based discrimination or gender-based violence, regular and objective gender pay gap audits by a qualified external party, and action to ensure jobs of equal value are remunerated equally. It seeks to support women's employment and strive for gender balance at all levels across the business and also the supply chain. Cornerstone Capital Group identified the concept of access as the key common denominator underpinning all their sustainable development goals. And the 7 access themes to achieve gender equality are access to fair treatment, equal opportunity, access to healthcare and financial services, to telecommunication systems and education, to clean water, sanitation and hygiene, and access to adequate housing and living conditions. These access themes are interrelated. For example, improving women's access to telecommunication tools such as mobile phones and internet services enables better access to online financial services, educational resources, healthcare, and career opportunities. Becoming more educated and having better access to financial services may result in becoming more financially secure. Internet access may correspond with improved health for women as they can learn about disease risks and prevention. So investing in women-led businesses is of course wonderful, but we also need to focus on systemic change. Engaging with companies to improve gender outcomes is an important approach to gender lens investing. It's often used in conjunction with the other GLI strategies. As more asset managers track metrics, such as the representation of women across all levels of an organisation, the more likely they are to engage with companies and encourage better diversity, gender-balanced workplaces, and reduced pay gaps. Some gender equality indicators, such as corporate culture, are more difficult to quantify, and meeting with company managers is necessary when public data is not available. Engagement and dialogue is helpful in understanding a company's processes, products, and practices. And unlike fossil fuels or gambling, gender outcomes can be engaged on generally without disrupting a company's normal business model. And this brings us to our exciting news. So Altiorem has today released our inaugural expert guide on gender lens investing. Now, if you're here live, there will hopefully be a link in the chat shortly, if it's not there already, to take you to it directly. If you're listening to the replay, head to the top navigation menu on the Altiorem website and just click on the Insights tab, so altiorem.org/insights. And the expert guide expands on what we've covered today. It explores the what, the why, and also the why not. So we dive into the challenges to gender lens investing. The how is covered and looks at the strategies, including best practice and case studies or examples of GLI investment products. There's also a great Learn More section with some excellent resources, including a free course. There's access to company and fund gender equality scores and also tips to searching the Altiorem library for the best gender-focused results. But to get you started, my ninja tip for searching the Altiorem library on gender is head up to the navigation menu up the top of the page, click on the library tab, then SDGs, and then search by SDG 5 gender equality. And then you'll get some really excellent research summaries on gender smart investing, inclusion, and diversity. And that brings the presentation part of our event to a close as we move into our panel discussion. So we've covered why gender lens investing is a good thing across the ethical investment, business and economic case for change, what investing with a gender lens looks like, so the evolution from 1.0 to 2.0, and how we can support women by investing in access themes and engaging with companies on gender outcomes. And you can find out more in our expert guide. So joining us in our panel discussion today is Ivka Kalus, co-founder and CIO of Prometheus Capital and the Global Small Cap Gender Forward Fund, Julia Mason, co-founder of gender lens consulting firm Equity JV, and Emily Macpherson, ESG research analyst and economist and author of several large research reports, including on the gender pay gap. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you for joining us today. So we're going to start this panel discussion off. And firstly, I'm just going to go around the room and just if you could just briefly introduce yourself and just let us know what your motivation is for using gender lens investing, either in your business or your investment process, or your why for focusing on gender issues, even in research as well. So I think maybe Ivka, if you could start us off there.
Sure, and it's so nice to be here, and I guess I'm the only North American on the call, but I have a very, very special place in my heart for Australia. I've been there 5 times. I have some very dear friends there, and my kids' very favorite trip we ever made as a family was hiking in Tasmania for 2 weeks. So anyway, I wish I was there with you today. As Alexandra said, I'm the co-founder and CIO of Prometheus Capital. We manage institutional assets mostly for U.S. State pension funds and for foundations. We build concentrated global and international, which for U.S. investors means ex-U.S. equity portfolios that have significantly superior ESG characteristics, and that really includes gender. And Alexandra cited our characteristics in the strategy that we have that really amplifies the gender factor. The way we see it is that diversity, namely gender diversity, is an ESG super factor because it's correlated to other ESG factors like carbon intensity and governance. And again, as Alexandra presented, third-party research shows very clearly that it is a significant idiosyncratic performance factor, which is why we amplify gender diversity in all of our portfolios as part of our mandate to deliver superior risk-adjusted returns for our clients, which is what we do. So that's the why.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Ivka. And Julia?
Well, thank you. And thank you for this, Alexandra. It's a fantastic event. Thank you, Ivka, for putting out the business case. So that leaves that one ticked off. So I'm co-founder of Equity JV, a company I founded with Vicky Ditcham. We mainly operate from Melbourne, Australia and Sydney, Australia. We work, our consultancy works with advisors and their clients to invest with a gender lens, and the client base is mainly made up of private investors and larger investors such as family offices, foundations, charities, and trustees and boards of directors who are managing their investment capital. And they may be looking to align their values and amplify their strategy to their stakeholders. My background is mainly in corporate land, but I have myself been working as a director for about 17 years, which is a big advantage, and I understand how companies make decisions. And certainly from a research point of view, know how to get under their decision-making process and see what's really going on. My why, using finance as a tool to achieve systemic change, and really as society becomes more progressive, to give investors a strategy to invest in gender equality. So that's it. Thank you, Alexandra.
Fantastic, Julia. And Emily.
Thanks, Alexandra, and morning, everyone. Good evening, Ivka. It's lovely to be here. So yeah, my name is Emily Macpherson. I'm an ESG analyst and economist. I just recently worked at JP Morgan, where I headed up the ESG research team. My main focus was on, exactly like Alexandra has said as well, on the pay gap, on gender diversity across listed companies, so in Australia and Asia Pacific mainly. One of the biggest reports that we did there, which hopefully might be sent to you after this, was called The Pay Check, and it was just all looking at the pay gap, so the economic drivers of it, but also company policies and what listed companies are doing to help narrow it. In terms of my why, I really thought about this one, but I think it also goes to what, Alexandra, you said in your presentation, that diversity is something that everyone here and everyone not here could agree on, that it's good for businesses, it's positive for innovation, it's important for the evolution of a company. I like to be able to prove that in research. But then on a personal note, I think young women in finance, I understand the importance of diversity, and I love the idea that I could see my future self in my colleagues or my the people that I work for. So yeah, that's it.
That's great, thank you. And I think we'll probably stay on the topic of metrics, because we've had a number of questions about metrics actually, and I think maybe I'll just stay with you, Emily, for this bit, because you have done that extensive research on diversity in the boardroom, but also gender pay gap. So what are some of the metrics or policies that either in any of your roles or in your research that you came across, and also were there any challenges with determining some of those metrics or gender indicators?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something that every research analyst said. It says is the biggest challenge is data availability. It's kind of a constant thing that we kind of love to say, but it is quite true. And you touched on it as well. It's very hard to quantify aspects of what we're talking about. It's culture, it's trust, it's commitment, it's stuff like that. So in terms of the metrics, the ones that I focused on, so just on the pay gap, for example, the way that I decided to have a look at this area was to focus on policies that are helping to support parents, and then obviously particularly mothers. There's fantastic research out by the Australian Treasury last year that shows the impact of time away from the workforce, and it's one of the kind of key economic drivers of the pay gap. The other one's obviously underrepresentation of women in senior roles, which you've touched on, and then industrial segregation. So the idea that men dominate primarily higher paying industries. But on the time spent out of the workforce, primarily to take care of children, we looked at the policies that companies are implementing and what they're doing and how committed they are. There's fantastic data out there, especially from our Workplace Gender Equality Agency. They have a whole sort of suite of data from all the private companies in Australia. And those policies obviously include parental leave, but they're also stuff like just communications with ongoing parents, and also internal childcare, either on-site or subsidized. And then the biggest one, which there has been research done that shows quite a big impact on retention, is superannuation payments during maternity leave as well. The Australian government has been quite for a lack of word, difficult on this over the years, but companies are very good at doing this. The majority of Australian listed companies at least do provide superannuation payments during parental leave. So those are just some of the sort of, I would call them metrics of which we can actually sort of score a company on whether they provide them. But yeah, in terms of the other ones, there's obviously a whole suite of them, and I won't go into all the detail on them, but there's the gender balance of the board, of management and employees. We did some very extensive research on the proportion of female employees in companies because we figured that there's a lot of research done on boards, which is fantastic, but we sort of wanted to look at the overarching company level, employee level of the company, and found some great work just looking at those that have really seen growth in their employees and their representation of women, how that has affected their performance as well. So yeah, there's lots, which is great, but still some way to go, I think, to really understand and quantify it. Yeah, I would say, but interested in what the others think.
Absolutely. I think Ivka, will go to you next because we've just mentioned the board diversity metrics and what have you. So I guess maybe could you just step us through a bit of your process, and because you do focus on some of those metrics quite well in your fund.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned gender diversity 1.0, gender lens 1.0 going to 2.0, and I think we are power investors in 1.0 or maybe 1.5, looking to invest in companies that have superior diversity as an important driver of competitive advantage versus peers, and therefore better long-term returns. That was my why, obviously. I think the nice thing about being able to stick to 1.0 in just taking that high-level data is that it is the best populated ESG factor, period, in terms of data availability. And where it isn't available, it's relatively easy to count women, at least on boards and in senior management. And so what we do is we rank our universe of 6,000 securities for women in the C-suite, women on boards, women in senior management, and we screen out the laggards before we ever consider any stock for investment. Now, there's no perfect companies in terms of diversity, but at the portfolio level, it's actually relatively easy to build in a significantly better gender diversity metric compared to the benchmark. And we report that quarterly to our clients along with other ESG factors like carbon intensity. And so it seems really simple, and we do, on the sort of 2.0 side of it is really looking below the surface once we identify where we want to focus our attention and doing the fundamental research. We definitely focus on what companies are doing to make women's lives better. So that's important. But really, there's still so much alpha or return potential in just doing that one simple thing. We're so far from parity in any industry. There's only a handful of companies in the world that actually have more than 50% women on the board or over 50% women in management, literally a handful, maybe two handfuls, maybe there's 10 out of that 6,000 security universe. So we're so far, and what investors love is arbitrage. So that's, thinking about how we can arbitrage a huge performance factor in our portfolios. We can just use the data to at least get us to the right pool of securities and then build from there.
Fantastic, yes. And we're going to come back to alpha and risk and return a little bit in a little bit, but I might just go to you, Julia, too, because you work with advisors and investors to create unique gender lens strategies. So what are some of the examples of the strategies, themes, or metrics that you focus on?
Thank you, Alexandra. So I think that it's useful to understand that gender lens investing is a spectrum of strategies or a spectrum of actions. So it's quite the umbrella term for a number of ways to approach investing in gender equality. And I think that it's important in an investor-led way to understand what are the important gender factors for those investors. So for many investors, it is very much a reflection of gender lens investing 1.0, as Ivka's pointed out. And then I guess the universe is a little bit easier in terms of options available because of the gender lens funds that are available, and because of the data that's available. But for an investor who is a little bit more interested in perhaps product and services, or perhaps in First Nations and gender diversity, then it's important to know that, because then you actually makes your research job much easier to carry out. So I think in terms of the how, it can be a matter of depending on what the investor believes is their important gender factors. So if that turns out to be funds, or if it turns out to be ESG funds with a very strong gender indicators, or if it turns out to be a different type of strategy that needs to be exercised through different types of different themes. For example, as I've mentioned, First Nations, or perhaps even looking at the record of controversies for companies more broadly. So I hope that's useful for you, Alexandra.
Yes, I'm sure it is, and for the audience as well. I think there is so much interest in metrics and the policies as well, like digging into those policies. We've had a question from the audience that they sometimes struggle to find appropriate metrics beyond the gender splits across the different levels of a company. And so I think you've given some great examples of how we can look at those different policies and get that data. So the main challenge with getting buy-in on gender lens investing from corporates and investors is this discussion of investment returns. And there's been limited and mixed research over the years looking at several different return metrics and finding differing levels of evidence. In fact, just recently there was a release of a BlackRock paper and lifting financial performance by investing in women, and there's been huge backlash of that by academics for inconsistencies in the measurements of both performance, but also measurements of gender diversity. So I just was wondering, like, to the panel, anyone can answer this, but do you think that this limits the potential of gender lens investing in any way? So, or how do you expect this to evolve so that we have, I guess, more robust research in this sphere? And also, have you found this to be a challenge in your own discussions with stakeholders?
So I think one aspect that's important for advisors in the construction of portfolios too is the fact that the gender factors can be different between different industries. So there's very clear examples of this within the mining resources industry within Australia. There's been a couple of reports last year regarding sexual harassment and Rio Tinto. There's also aspects of risk at a company level that have shown the relationship between the gender-based violence is a stronger indicator of political stability and market stability than, I guess, the average assessment for a country, which can be the stability of state institutions and wealth factors. So I think just to throw that in there, it's rather than only focusing, I suppose, company level risk, it's important to consider gender factors within different industries, and also if we're talking about different countries as well.
Definitely. Sorry, Ivka, did you have something there? You're just on mute.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Sorry.
So I would disagree. Well, I didn't see the study that they put out, but you've mentioned a lot of research that focuses on specific outcomes, and that is still not investment returns. But there has been work done on investment returns, and we like to use this one study that was actually, it's already getting a little old, 3 years old, that looked at, because the controversy about ESG factors has been going around and around and around a lot here, a lot more maybe here in the US. And so what they did, it was an Italian team of quants that took as many ESG factors as they could find, raw data, and also scores from like MSCI and Sustainalytics, but raw data, including a lot of diversity data, and just applied machine learning to backtest all of these factors. And the results were that out of about 250 factors, 17 came in with statistical significance, idiosyncratic alpha. Of that, a little over half, so 9 were climate related, but 8 were sort of S and G related, and of those 3 were diversity. So there is, to me, it doesn't feel like, if anyone wants to question it, that doesn't matter, because our clients hire us for returns. And so that's how we're using this factor. And again, it is the most powerful ESG factor out there, partly because it's well reported, it's idiosyncratic. And so you can find alpha in it, or at least you can test for alpha in it, and the results speak for themselves. So that's the slide we always show in our presentations when our clients ask us about why we consider that when we're constructing portfolios.
Thank you. Yes, and I've just had another question actually from the audience. So we've talked a lot about diversity, and I mentioned in my presentation diversity and inclusion. So, you know, does anyone have a perspective on inclusion as distinct from diversity? Because a company can be superficially diverse, but if a woman doesn't feel like their perspectives or they're safe to say or do things, if that's not included, then, you know, almost what is the point of increasing numbers of women when, you know, they're not actually getting that inclusion?
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to talk for you to be talking about the Agenda 2.0. So the really, you know, this is why we have brilliant people like Ivka looking at these factors as well, is because it's not always obvious. And really, if your client's in an ESG fund, that may mean nothing because it doesn't have any gender indicators within the ESG screening. If the ESG analyst is not looking at cultural indicators of the company and going through workplace policies, if within their annual report the words sexual harassment and family violence don't seem to be able to be mentioned because the company is not across those issues, then they're great indicators as well. So I think that diversity and indicators of diversity is manifests itself in a lot of other ways, and it's up to great people within the investment community to be able to look at that, rather than, it's the same within climate change. There are lots of different aspects of whether a company is actually meaningfully taking account of climate change. It's not just about the superficial numbers. So unfortunately.
Yeah. That's so true. And I think mentioning climate change, I think that we will go to that now, because, you know, in my presentation, we did touch on the intersection between global issues like climate change and gender. Now, I might go to you, Emily, first, because in our discussions ahead of this event, you mentioned some interesting reports on gender and climate change. So would you mind sharing some key findings there?
Yeah, sure. There's been some great work done comparing the two. So there's this Compass report that's done on climate and has been done for many years. And then there's been a gender Compass report that's been done recently. And it's basically a survey of Australians just trying to gauge their sort of commitment or engagement with or concern for these particular issues. And the Climate Compass report found that 17% of people still are rejectors of climate change. So they still sort of believe that there isn't anything that we need to be concerned about, and it's not humans that are up to it. The majority, in terms of the demographic, the majority of those respondents are the 60 to 65 plus sort of retiree cohort. Whereas in the Gender Compass report, there's about a sort of similar percentage, about 18%, that believe gender equality isn't actually an issue, that we've almost gone too far, that women have enough rights, and we've sort of reached the capacity anyway. The majority of that age group, really interestingly, is in the 16 to 39-year-olds. They're fantastic reports if you are able to find them. And that is a really interesting comparison. So they compared the two and said that climate change is almost something that most people can agree upon. And in a couple of years' time, everyone will be very much engaged in the issue. Whereas on gender, we've got a younger generation that is coming up, which is a little bit more of a harder challenge. So it's a really interesting idea that perhaps gender needs, that gender is maybe a more pressing issue, or at least needs better marketing, at least. But yeah, really interesting.
Yeah. Actually, I might just follow that with there is a question in the chat box, because and I'm not going to assume that cohort of younger people are male, but the question is, any tips for helping transition male colleagues to become a gender diversity ally?
That's a really, they actually are, they're straight male. 69% of that cohort is straight male.
I didn't want to assume.
Yeah, but it's a really interesting question, actually. So just a very quick personal story. I mean, as being a sort of young woman in finance in a large company, I was part of a lot of committees, and I was on sort of every single gender diverse committee that you could be on. Whereas my male colleagues were not, and they didn't have a lot of extracurricular activities that they were doing as part of their other work and their kind of contribution to the company. I would say one of the biggest sort of tips, and Rachel, thank you for your question, is that to encourage men and other colleagues to get involved in these activities, or at least even set up sort of committees or organizations within the internal company that encourage men to get involved. I mean, it was great to be part of all of these female-led and women-only committees in the company, but I know that the men wanted to be involved, but they almost didn't feel that they could be because this was a women's space. So I think having some of those spaces would be great, because they have a lot to do and they have a lot to help with as well.
Yeah.
That would be my tip.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to suggest any ways? Because I'm sure as women in finance that you have had to have discussions with men, and how have you approached that and helped them, I guess, to see a different perspective?
Look, I don't have any specific tips, but I can say that for people who've come to an opinion through emotion, it's very difficult to throw stats at them and think that they're going to change their point of view. So it's the only thing I can say is that if someone's open to, if they're a data-driven person and they're open to conversations, and some meaningful data is important. And then I guess within the company itself, it's interesting to note whether the policies are informed by the experiences of victim survivors. So I don't know whether that's a step too far, but if your company has family violence policies, whether a victim survivor has come into the workplace to speak to at least the leadership team. So that's much more meaningful way for the company to understand what someone who's going through that horrendous struggle needs when they're in a workplace. And I must say that certainly within the Australian environment, I think within the larger ASX companies, that's certainly becoming much more common, because we're seeing much more higher rates of reporting of family violence. So not quite on point, but I suppose that's a relevant way to get in.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I presented on the 4 different cases for, making the case for gender equality through the ethical, investment, business and economic. And I think that really highlights the fact that depending on who you're speaking to, there's going to be different ways that you present this that are going to resonate better. Ivka, did you have anything to add on that one?
Sure. I think that, and especially this is from a U.S. perspective. I don't actually know the statistics in Australia, but in the U.S., asset management is the least diverse industry, period. And so women managers managing the money account for somewhere around 10% of managers, and manage less than 1.5% of assets. So there's a big issue, and I think that you had the same issue in a lot of other industries. You know, my mom was a doctor, and she was the only doctor in town. And when she went into the doctor's lounge, they sent her to the nurse's lounge, right? So there's, and now it's 50-50. So there's a point, and same goes with women on boards, that once you get to a certain point in the representation, all of a sudden the behavior changes, and it is, the new normal is very different from the old normal. And so the challenge is to get to that new normal, I think. And so the question was, how do you be the advocate? And I think it's partly is to challenge some of the assumptions about what an investor looks like and how an investor acts, right? Because there's all this stuff, oh, women take less risk. No, they don't. They take more calculated risk. They turn their portfolios a lot less. So all, you know, and overconfidence is very important in our industry. And I'm not overconfident because I know what I don't know, or at least I think I do, and I present that. And so sort of changing, allowing, if you're a colleague, a male colleague, allowing for that dynamic and accepting it as value added versus you're not sticking to the script because this is what an investor looks like, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, so these are all, I think that what we're doing here is, you know, creating internal change and doing it ourselves. But I wonder, maybe, do you see any regulatory pressures influencing gender or gender lens investing? I will open it up to anyone.
I mean, just on the regulatory, it's really interesting. So in Australia, we're introducing the public reporting of pay gaps, and that has been hugely important in the UK when they introduced that as well. But the pay gap and the differential between average women and men pay in the company is going to be publicly available, so every employee will be able to see it, and that's going to be from early next year, and that will be a really interesting area. And also just looking at the chat as well, which is fantastic, seeing everyone talking. Pablo's just talking about a male CEO not taking parental leave, for example. All of that data will be publicly available in the sense that how much of the take up by companies. So all of that data will be out there, obviously not at the individual level, but at an aggregate level for a company. So all of that will be very interesting. And that's been a big push from government and advocacy groups to get this regulation change. So that'll be huge. But,
yeah, I think often we see as investors, we look at the ability of the board to read the room, and the room being not the room that they're in, but society. And as regulation in these areas increases, I think the material risk for companies also increases if they're not taking notice of what are important issues to their investors, being members of society. So I think particularly for directors, we've got a situation in Australia where there's increased liability for psychosocial incidents within their companies, and the duty is not just to remediate after they occur, but they have the duty to prevent them from occurring. So I think that really means that increased regulation will increase risk, and that's really important for investors to note. So, and to take account of these risks when they're looking at their portfolio.
And I think we are running out of time. So, and I really wanted to get to a brief discussion at the very least on engagement, because I think that really is a way that we can move the dial and really help companies and encourage them to have better gender outcomes. So I guess maybe Ivka, I would really appreciate your take on engagement regarding gender outcomes. What's been your experience?
My experience has been very positive, and we engage every company that we meet with. So you know, most of them we don't end up investing in because they don't make sense in a portfolio. But I have, given, you know, my gray hair, I've been doing this for a long time, and I have very long-term relationships with companies and have been bringing this issue up for the last 15 years, and pulling out the data and And so it's really, I think that's been really great. And some companies just don't see it that way until you present it to them in black and white. There was one company who I have really good relationship with, and they put out an annual report, and I brought it to a meeting, and I said, you know, what's wrong with this picture? And they said, what's wrong with this picture? It was a Dutch engineering company, and there was a huge A, which stands for their company. And I said, what's wrong with it? It was all white men making up the A. And I said, you know, is this the image you want to present when you're trying to increase your diversity, really to take advantage of all that talent that's out there, right? Mm-hmm. Because as we know, things have changed. You know, they're not quite parity, but close to parity in terms of grads of engineering schools, and so they're missing out. So that was just sort of like a light bulb went off, and then the next year it was a very different picture. And I think that sort of thinking about how they're attracting talent. So I think engagement is usually very positive as long as it's not attacking them. I think it makes management really reflect on how they can compete for our investors and, you know, for all of the capital owners, for our capital, and that's a differentiator. So I think it's a very positive conversation.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that great example too. Julia, I know that you help asset managers engage and that kind of thing. So what's, you know, what is I guess your process or some examples of how you help them engage with companies?
So for my 2 cents on this would be to make sure that the investors can have effective engagement with their managers. So if the fund manager can't say the words gender equality or can't understand what the investor's talking about when they ask for what are the gender factors in the ESG screens, and it's probably a good indicator of the level of deliberate investigation and transparency. So I think that that's a first thing. So for advisors, we like to make sure that they can effectively educate their investors on which questions to ask. And I think on just a broader point, when you're looking at engagement, you can also check out the, as Ivka said previously, the stats on the gender balance of the fund management that you're using. I think that overall institutional investors have a great record in gender equality, and certainly in the Australian context have had a large influence on the 40-40-20 movement, which is to increase the number of women on boards, which they are doing effectively. It's a slow process, as we know. But certainly that's an important part of it, as well as to make sure that your investors know which questions to ask.
Yeah, and obviously it sounds like an engagement. There might even be an education piece that goes along with that, because the person at the other end needs to understand what you're asking as well. Emily, I know that you saw a rise in the number of clients that were wanting to come up with a list of questions to engage. So, you know, just briefly, do you have an example maybe of questions that you put forward for engagement?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, just don't have an awful much more to add, because I absolutely agree with all of the other points. But no, definitely, I mean, corporate engagement took over ESG integration as the largest proportion of ESG assets in Australia last year. So there's a lot more, and there's a lot of power in it. I definitely was, all of the kind of client requests that were coming through later on in the year were asking for specific questions on how to really understand the culture, the trust, the commitment, and their understanding of it. So a couple of the questions were, and Ivka mentioned it actually, on hiring processes. Where are they looking? What are their pools like? And then also the initiation into the company. What are the new talent's first moments of meeting the company like, and trying to understand how they communicate that. And then just the other one that was quite a clear question that would be apparently quite valuable was, how do employees speak up? So if the management could understand what the processes are for speaking up about any particular incident or issue, and if they could understand how employees can do that and how they can report on them, that was truly valuable as well. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. We have come to time, but it's been we could talk for hours actually. And I'm sorry for the questions in the chat that I didn't quite get to, but please feel free to continue asking questions. Email Altiorem or any of our wonderful speakers today. The link is in the chat box for the expert guide. And thank you so much for joining us for our launch event.